Good morning. Good to be back. Teaching is what I do for a living and often for meaning, so I'm sorry about last Thursday. Apologize for the day off. We will make it back. I have a plan for that. And unlike most politicians, when I say I have a plan, I don't have to face the electorate, but I do have it. Anyway, we're going to cover a fair amount today, and I'm going to try to keep pushing through it. I want to start with a very famous quotation from the first public speech that a 29-year-old Abraham Lincoln ever gave. It's called the Young Men's Lyceum Speech. He delivered in Springfield, Illinois in 1838. This is a very young Abe Lincoln. He hadn't run for anything yet. But it shows the anxiety, both the confidence, the hope, and the dread of early antebellum and then later antebellum America. Was this a society, given its deep differences, that could still hold itself together? Were its institutions strong enough that they would hold back any conflict? And Americans in the 1830s had a tremendous faith in this thing called the Constitution. They really did. There was a reverence for the U.S. Constitution. Now, they interpreted it very differently. We're not accustomed to that, though, are we? In that speech, Lincoln concluded with this famous passage: "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step over the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never," he says. "All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined." Listen to that confidence. All of the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track on the Blue Ridge Mountains in a trial of 1,000 years. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of freemen, we must live through all time or die by suicide. The dude had a way with words, even when he was so young. And by the way, in my isolation over the weekend, I started reading deeper and deeper into Sinclair Lewis's Can't Happen Here, which you may remember is assigned later in the course. Damn, is it relevant to now. That's all I'll say. Now, just backing up, and by the way, that confidence, that hope in antebellum America, about this special place with its sense of chosenness, whether that's religious or secular enlightenment, kind of always avoiding the question of slavery. They'd figure it out. Jeffersonian idealism. Jefferson always said, "We'll figure that out." He had no plan. He didn't even promise one. But it's in the art. It's in Whitman's unbelievable poetry by the 40s and 50s. I once counted how many times Walt Whitman used the opening, "Oh," at the start of a line in his famous poem, Passage to India, which is this dream-like, 60-page epic about America expanding everywhere. Passage to, oh, the mountains, oh, the rivers, oh, the oceans, oh, 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 oh. Walt couldn't stop. The painters, Caleb Bingham's famous, The Jolly Flatboatman of 1857. I mean, it's a joyous, fun. I mean, these are flatboatmen out on the, either the Ohio, the Missouri, the Mississippi, somewhere, and they're dancing and they're singing. What a cool image. Who wouldn't want to be at that party? Oops. I actually need that. I took a little detour into some social science, I guess just to give myself some credibility. Some of you may know the book, a gigantic bestseller called How Democracies Die, published by two Harvard government professors, political scientists. It's actually a good read. Now, they do what political scientists do. They're going to model everything for you, and they're going to give you categories, and their history's a little loose, but they have a whole section on the passage of the American Civil War, and they say bluntly, the Civil War broke America. It broke it. Just broke it. It's one of the purposes of this course. How'd that happen? And what afterlives did that leave? This is Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. They make a persistent case, sometimes in a tepid social science language, but they make a powerful, persistent case that norms, practices, customs about our Constitution and our laws and our legal system and our political system, norms, you've heard a lot about this in recent years, norms are dying as much as the Constitution, or they're threatened anyway. They make a persistent case that norms, which they sometimes call guardrails and so forth, are often much more important than the actual strictures of the Constitution. That's unconstitutional. That's constitutional. We're very fond of that, and for good reason. But sometimes the norms or codes of conduct are more important. What would hold an American union together in this early 19th century, in the first 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades of the existence of this experiment, this American republic? Many people have argued over the years, most recently Alan Taylor in a terrific new book, brand new book, great historian, and only Alan would, not many historians attempt books like this anymore. He calls it American Civil Wars, plural, a continental history from 1850 to 1873. Now, Alan says, and he's repeating many other historians, the United States never was a nation throughout the whole antebellum era. And I think that's somewhat debatable, to say the least, because there's a hell of a lot of nationalism in both South and North. John C. Calhoun was an American nationalist at one stage in his life. So I became Secretary of War and Vice President and kept running for president. But mostly, Taylor argues, and others have, that it was more a union of these still fairly independent states trying to hold themselves together. Yeah, they call themselves a nation, but they were really this coalition of states with very different views on how the Constitution should be used, could be used to hold that together. For Ziblatt and Levitsky, these two, the guys who wrote How Democracies Die, and by the way, they use all sorts of examples. One of the best examples, fascinating section, is on the Spanish Civil War. You want a case of watching a democracy die fast, even faster than the Weimar Republic did. Look at the Spanish Civil War, folks, which between about 1931, 32, and 36 collapsed into fascism and all-out bloody civil war. We don't think about that as much as we do what happened in Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany and even, Japan. But to Zimblad and Levitsky, they say that the two norms that will hold a democracy together or possibly revive it are these two. And we can keep testing this of what's happening in antebellum America. One they called mutual toleration. Now that sounds like a 5th grade lesson, doesn't it? Okay, children, today we will learn tolerance. You're gonna learn to like each other even when you don't. And it's gonna be fun. And you're gonna learn diversity. Well, okay, but in a serious way, what that means in political life is that you accept the legitimacy of your rival. A rival you may hate. A rival whose ideas you may truly hate. You just really disagree. But it's this frankly rather modern idea that you don't make your political enemy into an existential enemy who must be destroyed. That you have some faith in a structure you're living under to cooperate. It's what makes partisanship, oh, that dirty word we love to hate, it's what makes partisanship possible. In some democracies, of course, the opposite happens. And there are many examples throughout world history, especially modern history, or for that matter, ancient history. What happened in Greece? Oh dear. The second norm, did I put it? Yeah, I put them both up here. They call, this is where social scientific labels get boring, but they're important. They call it institutional forbearance. What does that mean? It means people learn to believe in the institutions they create even when they don't work perfectly. They find a way to make them work. They use what these two guys call patient self-control and restraint. Now, wouldn't that be nice? Let's just be nice. Let's everybody take a niceness oath at Congress instead of to the United States Constitution. Well, maybe we should do both. Leaders don't use, in other words, under this idea of institutional forbearance, they don't use all the power they may have because it could destroy the structure overall. Institutional forbearance means you use institutions for political survival of a whole instead of victory for my part. Now, who's not for victory for your part? You believe in something? You want to win. I do. I want to win. And sometimes I feel like burning the villages of my opponents, so to speak, metaphorically or politically. This is where precedent and practice and mores and norms come in. And it's the only way institutions can forbear. Now, think back before we had democracies or any decent ones that worked. And how many were there in the world in the 1830s? Switzerland, the United States. They really tried in Europe in the Republican revolutions of 1848, and the monarchies crushed them at the barricades in blood. Kings never had mortal constraint. But kings even found out they had to accept some norms. Otherwise, the nobles may rise up and have their heads. And that happened many times, didn't it? Kings throughout history have been known to survive by accepting certain institutional forbearance and norms. I'll do this, but not that. Without this problem, Shakespeare wouldn't have written all those history plays. Think of Richard II, or many others. As early as the 1830s, we had the greatest of American statesmen already, and they will come back on Thursday with a big bang. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, others worrying out loud. As early as the 1830s now. This very confident, confident until the panic of 1837, an economic depression which threw all kinds of people out of work and destroyed businesses. But in 1839, Henry Clay of Kentucky, who will play such a role in all these efforts to compromise this question of slavery, warned his country that a rupture of this union would produce civil wars. He worried these would be wars that would leave, quote, desolated fields, conflagrated cities, murdered inhabitants, and the overthrow of the fairest fabric of human government that ever rose to animate the hopes of civilized man. Clay seemed pretty worried. And then Daniel Webster by 1851. By then sort of in disgrace in his own state of Massachusetts because of his support of the Fugitive Slave Act. More on that later this week or next week. Webster said, quote, "The union of these states is the all-absorbing topic of the day. On it all men write, speak, think, and dilate, from the rising of the sun to the going down thereof." How do we hold this together? They kept worrying. They had reason. Of course, the reason is slavery, but we need to break that down, don't we? A lot. All right, let's make some comparisons today without playing too loose and free with stereotypes, although aren't they fun sometimes? You know, the truth is, if you just take some economic or statistical measures, the North and the South, these two sections of the United States, who we know were on a destined path of conflict and war, they did not know that. They worried about it constantly and warned each other, threatened each other, but they didn't know that. No one had ever imagined Antietam or Gettysburg. But North and South by the 1840s were roughly the same geographical size. I'll show you that here, if I can. Oh, I just wanted to say, you know, Americans loved images like Bingham's Flatboatmen. They didn't necessarily love images like this photograph, this haunting photograph of a child laborer in Lowell, Massachusetts. She's about 10 years old, totally exploited. And they really didn't like images, even in the South. They hated these lithographers who kept drawing images of slave coffles. Coffles of human beings chained often at the ankles, certainly at the wrist, and marched across the country as much as 1,000 miles from slave pens and slave traders in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, all the way out to the Southwest, the Mississippi Valley, even to East Texas. Approximately 1,000 American enslaved people were transported, most of them by land, over a 40-year period, about 1820, 1860. Most of them by land, but a great number of them also by sea, the maritime trade, especially around to the ports of Mobile, the great slave ports of Mobile and New Orleans. Americans didn't like these images, but anti-slavery artists or lithographers or just people making a good buck were fond of making them. This map will be self-explanatory. The geographic size of North and South, roughly the same. They all spoke the same English language, although with very different dialects, as we all know. Thank God accents and dialects still survive in this country. I mean, really. I can still remember as a teenager borrowing my dad's car. Actually, I was a freshman in college. We went much further than he had agreed that I could go. But we were looking for all kinds of Civil War sites and historic sites, and we were in a little diner restaurant in Georgia one morning, and I could not understand the waitress. It was so embarrassing. This kid from Michigan, I could not understand her. She was actually asking me if I wanted grits. In the end, I found that out. I didn't get it. Somebody, I think, came over and said, "Grits?" "Oh, no, thank you." They were almost all Christian, although very different kinds of Christians, but they did practice the same sort of religion. They had very similar political ideologies in North and South through these decades on the surface. They believed in republicanism for certain people. They had a great deal of localism in their political sensibilities, a great deal, and in their economic sensibilities, and even nationalism. You could find the same degree of nationalism in Louisiana as you could find in Massachusetts in the 1830s and 40s. This America, this thing, this experiment, it was new and it was special and it was providential. Now, I prefer to define it, not you. They had a faith in progress. Progress. This was the century of progress, and America was put here by God or ideology or nature to be the engine of progress. And they shared a westward movement. Oh, God, did they. We think of the westward movement as this Conestoga wagons going out of the north. No, it isn't. The westward movement was very southern and very much about slavery. They shared prosperity and growth in good times and panics in bad times, although they're going to start blaming each other for the panics, the economic depressions. And in distribution of wealth, if you just take a pure economic measure, by 1861, having said all this, you're going to think, hell, why do we have a civil war? Why don't they just have a commission and work it out? By 1861, both sections, the slave states and the free states, in those sections, less than 1% of real and personal property was held by approximately 50% of the free adult white males. Sort of the same distribution of wealth in different things. The richest 1% in both sections, the great planters in the South and the rising merchant class, banking class, and by the 1850s, the railroad class, the richest 1% held 27% of all wealth. There's a lot of inequality in this society, and it's shared South and North in different ways. Both sort of had oligarchies of wealth and power. Both had dependent poor people of different races. That mattered. Now, the South, though, what do we know? What makes it different? What makes it peculiar? What makes it distinctive? Why does the New York Times still employ Margaret Wrinkle as their Southern columnist? I love her writing. Her piece today is on Jimmy Carter. It's actually incredibly moving. She does it's a paean to Jimmy Carter. You know, Times doesn't have to do that. In fact, at Yale University, we don't even teach a course in Southern history anymore. My colleagues in my department have decided, oh, there are far more things more important than the American South. Really? Have they looked at any recent election? How about the economy? How about Sunbelt politics? How about that very term, Sunbelt? South's always been called a belt of one kind or another, a black belt, slave belt, a lot of belts. I guess the Sun Belt's the only one that still holds up. But the South has always had a distinctiveness. Possibly it always will, although it's a very different South now, and you all know this. There's so many different kinds of Southerners. I've all my life been going to the South, studying the South. I have many friends in the South, from the South, because of the South. To me, there's almost nobody more interesting in this culture than a really progressive white Southerner who knows what they're overcoming. There's no passion quite like that. Don't be pointing here. You may have one next to you. They're here and they're there, and they could be anywhere. Thomas Jefferson left us an unforgettable description of the kind of stereotypical differences of Northerners and Southerners. And man, did this guy have a way with words. This is in late 1780s. Jefferson chose his adjectives very carefully. There was his description to a foreign correspondent who wanted to understand, what's the difference between you Southerners and Northerners? What's up with that? Jefferson's answer. The people of the South, he said, I'm sorry, forgive me. The people of the North, he started with the North. He saved his best for his own. People of the North are, quote, cool. He didn't mean the same thing. Sober, laborious, persevering, independent, jealous of their liberties, chicaning, superstitious, and hypocritical in their religion. He couldn't miss that one. Basic agnostic that he was. He doesn't stick it here somewhere to the Puritans. But in the South, he said, they are, quote, fiery, voluptuary. That can mean a lot. Indolent, unsteady, independent, zealous of their liberties. One side is jealous of their liberties, the other is zealous of their liberties. Amazing use of that phrase. But, he says, trampling on those of others, generous and candid, and without attachment or pretensions to any religion but that of their own heart. Jealous of their liberties, zealous of their liberties. Now, all that's a lot of stereotype making. But it's more than just a little fun, I think. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, which I bet half of you have read, if not 2/3 of you have read, you probably won't remember this line. But you know, Southerners are black and white, and Hispanic, and Asian, and every kind of element of American pluralism today. Just go visit Georgia. Go visit North Carolina. Toni Morrison has a little line where Paul D., the male character who is a damaged survivor of slavery, says to Sethi, the mother of Beloved, Sethi, me and you, we got too much yesterday. We need more tomorrow. Now, Morrison could have had Sethi speaking for all kinds of Southerners. We got too much yesterday. We need more tomorrow. We got too much past. Can we just get beyond it, over it, pass it by? Then there's Faulkner. I mean, without the American Civil War, there'd be no William Faulkner. What would he have written about? How or why would he have created that imaginary place in and outside of Oxford, Mississippi? There's a little throwaway line in one of Faulkner's lesser-known novels called The Hamlet, where one character says to another, a white Southerner, says, quote, only thank God men have done learned how to forget quick what they ain't brave enough to cure. Can't cure that, can't solve that, don't know what to do about that. Forget it. Look away. Look away. Dixieland. Forget quick. Or even better, the great novelist Allen Gurganus. You may know his work. He's a North Carolina writer. I think he's still with us. He wrote, among other terrific books, The Oldest Confederate Widow Tells All, this massive tome, one of the greatest satires ever done about Civil War memory. Gurganus said, quote, "The South has a tradition of attempting the impossible at great cost, proudly celebrating the failure, and then gaining admiration for the performance." Let's go try something and fail, man. And if we really fail gloriously, the world will admire us. Because the world does admire glorious failures, if you can portray it that way. Now, at the end of the day, of course, the South was a slave society. Its most distinctive feature was, of course, racial slavery from earliest days. If you just want to start with the wake of the American Revolution, or from the origins of American racial slavery in the 17th century. American slavery became racial slavery. That was not the case all over the world. And that has, of course, enormous implications here. What is the slave society, though? And what will be this free labor society in the North? Free society, yes, with free in some quotes. Free but not equal, but free. In the South, race came to be equated with enslaved labor and therefore chattel slavery. Slaves in the American South became what they had been all over the world in one form or another, and that is an outsider, a social outsider, non-citizens, persons defined out of the polity, out of civic life, and as labor. Valued as labor, sold as labor, mortgaged as labor, owned as property. In increasing numbers that dominated everything about Southern society. There were unique features to this North American system of slavery by the time the antebellum generations are inheriting it. First of all was its permanent and inheritable status. There wasn't any way out of it. There wasn't any mobility out of it, as there were in some slave systems around the world. It has been argued that the South didn't develop a full, complete aristocracy of slaveholders, in which case American slavery might have evolved a bit differently. Now, that's been a big debate among historians, and I'll leave that on the table for the moment. It also is the one slave system in modern history that expanded far further and far more than any other. It just grew like crazy. It did not have to be replenished by imports. It became the only slave system in modern history that naturally reproduced itself. The northern slave population is the only one that did that, except for Russia. Russia is a system of serfdom. It's enslavement of a form, but different. In Brazil, for example, one of the other huge slave societies in the world in the 19th century, there were more, in fact, far more free blacks by the time Brazil finally ended slavery in the 1880s than there were enslaved blacks, because it was a system that had ways in and out of it and mobility out of it. What's a slave society? Let me give you a definition. It is a society, generally speaking, where most of that enslaved population is agricultural labor. Not always, but most of it is. It is a society in where everything about the economy is tied to it. Or put another way, slavery and race, in this case of the American South, affect everything. Whites and blacks and Native Americans grew, and Native Americans were on both sides of this question eventually, grew up, were socialized, married, reared children, worked, invested in, and conceived of property, and honed their most basic habits and values and mores under the influence of human slavery. That's why Jefferson was so worried about it. He famously worried about the boisterous passions, his phrase, boisterous passions that this system was causing. He didn't know what to do about it. Poor Tom. There were essentially 6 genuine slave societies in world history. Actually, 6, if we count Russia, and we should. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Brazil, from the 17th century on. Don't forget that little interesting statistic. The 60% of all Africans who came in the Atlantic slave trade to the Americas over 385 years came south of the equator. That's about Brazil. And its sugar kingdom. The fourth was the Caribbean. The British West Indies, the French West Indies, the Dutch West Indies, the Spanish West Indies. The West Indies were the aim and end of so many empires and so many slave systems. And then the final was this American South. Societies where everything about the economy, about mores, about philosophy, about ideas, about education, bumped into this system or were shaped by it. And by the late antebellum period, the leaders of this American South, and they come, as you may know, more on this when we get to the 50s, they come to dominate the United States government. 2/3 of all members of the Supreme Court before 1860, Southerners. 2/3 of all presidents of the United States, Southern slaveholders. Way more than half of members of the U.S. Senate, Southern slaveholders. But what they're going to have to decide is whether their system, their civilization, which whatever you want to call it, is going to be safer in or out of an American republic. Because they have to live in, unlike all of the other slave societies, a little bit of an exception of Brazil by the end of the period. All the other slave societies did not have to deal with the fact that they existed within a republic, which means they're going to be under tremendous criticism, threat, pressure, and they got to find norms through which to deal with each other. And they're going to be sitting on the largest financial asset in the entire economy. Now, let's move north for a little bit. I knew I'd grow to hate myself for combining too many things in one lecture, because I could just keep talking on this all day. But we can't do that. In the north. And again, I'm not intending to be stereotypical here. This is sometimes called facts. The North had a market revolution. You've heard that term. There's some famous books written on it, some controversial books written on it. But it boils down to this. If the South was a slave society by the 1820s, 30s, 40s, the North was becoming a market society. Doesn't mean it'll all be anti-slavery because of that. But it's going to mean there's going to be a serious concern about the future of slave labor because of this. The northern states were hurtling toward a future very different. Different and frightening to many Southerners. long-distance commerce. Look at this map for a moment. The map is pretty obvious. The dots represent the enslaved population in America from 1821 on the upper map to 1859 on the southern map. And by the way, if you want to know where power was, power in the Old South, power came from where the slave population was. There were more millionaires in the Mississippi Delta or the Mississippi Valley by the late 1850s than in the rest of the United States put together. We think of millionaires and billionaires today with New York City, tech bros, Texas, etc. No. Most of the millionaires were planters from the Mississippi Valley, and they thought they had a permanent system. They thought they had an OPEC. They thought they had a Silicon Valley that would be forever. They thought they were General Motors. Now, that may not mean anything to some of you, but I grew up in a General Motors town. General Motors was forever. I mean, it's still there, but it ain't what it was when I was growing up. The transportation revolution, the technological revolution, I want to focus on that in just a second. The growth of cities, communication revolution. We've talked about Samuel Morse's telegraph. I'll get some Yale people back into this more and more next time. Growth of cities, market centers. Subsistence farming more and more was becoming mixed agriculture. And it was already starting in the 18th century and is becoming more and more commercial farming, cash crops for a market. And what the market revolution ultimately does is changes mores, mentalities, habits, attitudes. It means most Americans by the 1840s are no longer making the things they need. They're going to we'd call it a grocery store, a market, a general store. They're even buying online from catalogs. They buy goods from each other. They don't make their own. They buy their soap. They don't make it anymore. They buy ready-made clothing. They don't make it anymore. They buy shoes. They don't make them anymore. They buy the shoes from Massachusetts. They buy their rifles and their guns from Connecticut, from right up the street on Winchester Street and up in Hartford at the Colt Factory. This is a new kind of economy the world had never quite seen. It's an economy of roiling consumerism and huge boost in production and GDP, but also booms and busts. And it's an economy that is rooted in this idea of free labor, that labor must be left free. Free for its mobility, free to move, free to get out west and own some land, become a mechanic, become a farmer, become an owner, own something, run something. Ralph Waldo Emerson and his famous essay, Self-Reliance, could not have been written in the American South. Manufacturing, machines, I can't stress this enough. But this is the age now, the United States government creates a patent office. How many have been to Washington and ever seen the grand old red brick building called the Patent Office? It's not actually technically used for patents anymore, but it's a grand building. It was one of the great creations in 19th century Washington, because it was one of the most important institutions in the federal government. They started issuing patents, oh my God, in the 1830s, well, even before that, but especially in the 1830s, and it became an industry to itself. These tinkerers, Connecticut's famous for that, inventors and tinkerers. Everybody in Connecticut was supposed to become Eli Whitney, I guess. In 1854 alone, the Patent Office gave 54 patents on harvesting implements, 39 on seed planters. I mean, how many seed planters do you need? 16 new patents on plows. Oh, plows. You can perfect a better blade and a better blade and a better blade, man, you got a patent. And you can make a lot of money on a patent. In 1856 alone, there were 40 new patents on sewing machines. Whoa. And some of these became industrial sewing machines. 31 on looms, 19 on locks. How many kinds of locks do you need? A lot, apparently. Invention, invention, invention. And then when the railroad begins to boom, and when the railroad became king, which is by the 1850s, it's beginning to be in the 1840s, all kinds of new inventions came with it, like the equalizer lever. You don't know what that is? Look it up. It made possible those damn locomotives and made them go a little faster. A last point I want to make about this is about Cyrus McCormick. Hey, I still got 4 or 5 minutes. Ooh. You know, too much can be made of an individual in a process like this. But he's a classic example of hundreds, thousands of others. And he got crazy rich on this from starting with nothing. Cyrus McCormick was born in 1809 in Virginia. His first patent was on a hillside plow in 1831. He didn't sell many of them. He operated an iron furnace in rural Virginia until he was wiped out in the economic panic of 1837. He did what anyone would do. He moved west. He went to Chicago. Now, Chicago isn't the railroad capital of the country yet. Within a decade, it's going to be. And it's going to make that McCormick reaper possible as well. On his first reaper, which is just a little combine, it's how you reap wheat with a horse drawing it. Oh, sorry, I have a picture of it. Whoa, I came equipped, man. Whoops, I'm sorry. Got to back up to that one. He only sold 7 of these machines the first time out. That ain't going to get it. He sold 29 by 1843. He was reviving. And by the time he moved to Chicago in the mid-1840s, he set up shop, built a small factory, then a larger factory, and by the end of the 1850s, he'll be producing, mass producing now, 5,000 reapers per year at an average price of $155. If you could get out west, get yourself as much as 20 acres, even 10 if it's under the Northwest Ordinance, but 20, 30, 40 would be even better, and a McCormick reaper, you had the American dream, or so it seemed. He went to competitions in England and in Europe. He won all kinds of awards and prizes. His company, by the 1870s, became International Harvester, which is what it still is today. The irony of McCormick, though, I guess, yeah, I mean, this is almost a norm in some ways. Don't forget where he grew up. He was bitterly and vehemently pro-slavery. He was a staunch Democrat by the 1850s. He opposed Abraham Lincoln's election. He hated the Republicans. He founded the Chicago Times, and he supported the Confederacy. So it makes him a lot like some of our Yale luminaries, a few of our Yale luminaries. Firearms were a big deal, very big deal, and in this town. The Winchester Company up the street, as I mentioned, and on this can go. I want to end, though, by simply signaling ahead here, because in the class you're reading Frederick Douglass's narrative, and at the heart of this dilemma, this union that almost everybody wants to hold together, although eventually Frederick Douglass hoped it would not hold together, were the slave narratives, the original form of African-American literature, the tales, the autobiographies of former slaves, a unique American genre of writing. The world never had a slave narrative genre before this. And there'd never been one quite like Frederick Douglass's. He publishes his first autobiography in 1845. He was 7 years out of slavery and 27 years old. Ask yourselves if you're going to be ready when you're 27 to write your first autobiography. Be careful. That takes audacity. And it better be good. And this was good. It is a work of literature. It is a work of autobiography. It is a work of history in a way. And it is a very manipulative text. I urge all of you to read it, even if you've read it before. And I'll leave you with just one of my many favorite passages from Douglass. I'm probably running out of time, but some of you have managed to hang around for the finale. He was, while a slave, teenage slave, he was hired out to a man named Edward Covey. And Covey used to beat him. He'd beat him mercilessly. He'd whoop him on every day but Sunday. Here we are. Covey was a mean old dude. And Douglass tells us in the narrative that on Sundays, Covey didn't beat people. He would give them the afternoon off. And I've been to this place. I've been to this ridge. I've seen this view. He says he would walk out under a tree up on a ridge and he'd look out on Chesapeake Bay. He's on the eastern shore of Maryland. This was Douglass on the page. This was Douglass's prophetic ability to find in metaphor and in narrative and in personal analysis of the meaning of slavery, what the country was going through. Did he know it at the time? Do any of us know it at the moment of writing that we have just fashioned an everlasting metaphor? Probably not. If you think you are, you're probably not. Prophets are generally unconscious of their prophecy. He stops at this point of describing going out onto the ridge on a Sunday and writes this. Our house, he said, stood within a few rods of the Chesapeake Bay, whose broad bosom was ever white with sails. Ever white with sails from every quarter of the habitable globe. If you've ever seen the Chesapeake on a summer day, you'll see a whole lot of white sails. Bigger ones today. Those beautiful vessels, robed in purest white, so delightful to the eye of freemen, were to me so many shrouded ghosts, to terrify and torment me with thoughts of my own wretched condition. I have often, in the deep stillness of a summer's Sabbath, stood all alone upon the lofty banks of that noble bay and traced with saddened heart and tearful eye the countless number of sails moving off to the mighty ocean. The sight of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, but there, with no audience but the Almighty, I would pour out my soul's complaint, which is a passage from the book of Job. And in my rude way, with an apostrophe to the multitude of ships. And then he puts his teenage memory in quotation marks, as though he's quoting his memory. And he speaks to the ships. You are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly around the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks and under your protecting wing. Alas, betwixt me and you, the turbid waters roll. Go on, go on. Oh, that I could also go. That's a haunting, unforgettable vision of what is freedom. Freedom is where we can see it imagined, but in this case, utterly denied. It is that mentality, that sentimentality, that analysis that's at the heart of this American problem of a union. And they don't have answers for him yet.